"Can I hug you just once?" the maid's toddler asked, and the billionaire couldn't hold back his tears. "Can I hug you? Just once?" 3-year-old Daisy stood in the middle of the grand marble foyer, her little hands clasped behind her back, looking up at the tallest, coldest man she had ever seen. Alexander Whitfield, 34 years old, CEO of Whitfield Industries, one of the richest men on the East Coast, stared down at her like she'd asked him to hand over the company itself. Nobody talked to Alexander like that. Nobody touched Alexander. Not anymore. If you've ever felt like grief built a wall around your heart so high that even sunlight couldn't climb over it, stay with me, because this story is for you. And if you believe that sometimes the smallest hands can do what the whole world couldn't, drop a comment below and let me know, because by the end of this video, you're going to believe it too. Before we dive in, welcome back to the channel. If stories like this, stories about broken men finding their way home through love they never expected, mean something to you, hit that subscribe button, because we've got so many more waiting for you. Now, let's go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Alexander Whitfield's Greenwich, Connecticut estate had felt less like a home and more like a museum built to honor something that no longer existed. 22 rooms. A private chef. A groundskeeper who tended 11 acres of gardens that nobody walked through. And in the middle of it all, one man who hadn't smiled in 731 days. He counted them. Every single one. 2 years ago, his wife Elena had been 6 months pregnant when the car taking her home from a doctor's appointment skidded on black ice outside of Stamford. She didn't survive. Neither did the daughter they'd already named Amelia. Alexander had been in a board meeting when the call came, negotiating a merger that, in hindsight, he couldn't even remember the details of. He remembered the phone ringing. He remembered the drive to the hospital, going 90 miles an hour, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. He remembered the doctor's face. After that, Alexander built walls. Not the kind you could see, but the kind that mattered more. Walls made of silence, of empty rooms, of a heart that had decided loving anyone again simply wasn't worth the risk of losing them. His household staff had learned the rules without ever being told them directly. Don't ask about his day. Don't mention his late wife's name. Don't bring your problems into his house, because he has no room left for anyone else's pain. The staff turnover at the Whitfield estate was notoriously high. Nobody could stand working for a man who moved through his own home like a ghost haunting it. Then Grace Miller arrived. Grace was 30 years old, a widow herself, though her story was different. Her husband, a construction worker, had died in a workplace accident 18 months earlier, leaving her alone with a 1-year-old daughter and a mountain of medical bills. She'd taken the housekeeping position at the Whitfield estate because it paid better than anywhere else in Fairfield County, and because the agency assured her the position came with flexible hours that would let her care for her little girl. What the agency hadn't mentioned was that the toddler would sometimes have to come with her. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitfield," Grace had said on her very first day, when her babysitter cancelled last minute and she showed up with Daisy on her hip, terrified she'd be fired before she'd even started. "It won't happen again, I promise. I didn't have anyone else to watch her." Alexander had looked at the little girl for a long moment. Dark curly hair. Enormous brown eyes. A stuffed rabbit missing one ear clutched against her chest. "Keep her out of the West Wing," he'd said flatly, and walked away. That was the extent of their first interaction. Grace assumed that was that, a warning, one strike, don't let it happen twice. But somehow, over the following weeks, Daisy kept ending up in rooms she wasn't supposed to be in. Not out of disobedience. Out of curiosity. And every single time, she seemed to find her way toward the one place in that enormous house where Alexander Whitfield sat alone. The library, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden Elena had designed but never got to see bloom. At first, he simply left the room when she wandered in. A grown man, retreating from a toddler in diapers, because even her presence felt like too much. Grace would find her daughter sitting alone on the antique rug, babbling to herself, utterly unbothered that the scary rich man had walked away again. "She doesn't understand the way other kids do," Grace tried to explain one afternoon, scooping Daisy up while apologizing for the 4th time that week. "She's not trying to bother you, sir. She likes people. She hasn't learned yet that not everyone likes her back." Alexander said nothing, but something in that sentence stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. Because the truth was, it wasn't that he disliked Daisy. It was that every time he looked at her round cheeks, her fearless little laugh, the way she reached for things without hesitation, he saw the daughter he never got to hold. Amelia would have been almost the same age now, had she made it into the world. Every giggle from Daisy Miller felt like salt poured directly onto a wound that had never once closed. He didn't hate the little girl. He was terrified of her. And terror, as anyone who has grieved deeply knows, wears the exact same face as coldness. Nobody looking at Alexander Whitfield from the outside could have told the difference. All they saw was a billionaire who couldn't be bothered to say a kind word to a toddler. But Daisy, 3 years old, too young to understand grief, too young to understand loss, too young to understand anything except that a very sad man lived in her mommy's workplace, Daisy saw something else entirely. She saw someone who needed a hug. And she was determined to give him one. What Alexander didn't know yet, standing in that foyer on the day this story truly begins, was that this 3-year-old girl was about to do something none of his lawyers, his board members, his so-called friends, or even his own family had managed to do in over 700 days. She was about to make him feel again. If you're new here, welcome. I promise you, this story only gets more emotional from here. And if a part of you is already feeling that lump in your throat, that's exactly how it's supposed to feel. Let's keep going. It started small. A crayon drawing left on Alexander's desk, a lopsided sun, a stick figure family, colors bleeding outside every line. He found it while reviewing quarterly earnings reports and nearly threw it away without looking. Something stopped him. He set it in his desk drawer instead, telling himself it was simply easier than dealing with Grace's apologies if he threw her daughter's artwork in the trash. He did not examine why he kept looking at it over the following days. Then came the day Daisy left a single wildflower, clearly pulled straight from the garden, roots and all, on the seat of his study chair. Alexander stared at the crumpled, dirt-covered flower for a full minute before Grace came rushing in, mortified, trying to sweep it away. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitfield, she must have." "Leave it," he said. Grace froze. It was the first time in 3 weeks of employment that he'd said more than 4 words to her. She likes to give people things," Grace said carefully, watching his face for any sign of anger. Her father used to say she had the biggest heart in the smallest body he'd ever seen. Something flickered behind Alexander's eyes at the mention of a father, past tense. He looked up at Grace properly, maybe for the first time. Her father passed. Grace nodded, arms wrapping instinctively around herself. 18 months ago. Construction accident. It's just been the 2 of us since. Alexander didn't respond. But that night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't work until midnight. He sat in his study with the wildflower still on the chair, and he thought about a woman raising a fatherless little girl in a world that had already taken so much from both of them, and yet that same little girl still walked around leaving flowers for strangers. Over the following weeks, something in the house began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. Alexander started arriving to breakfast 10 minutes earlier, right around the time Grace usually brought Daisy through the kitchen on her way to drop her at the estate's small-staff daycare room. He told himself it was a coincidence of scheduling. Nobody who knew him believed that, though nobody dared say it to his face. Daisy, for her part, had developed something like a mission. Every single day, she tried something new. She waved at him through doorways. She left small toys, a single plastic block, a lone puzzle piece, outside his study door like tiny offerings. Once, she managed to escape Grace's watchful eye long enough to toddle her way into a board meeting, marching straight up to Alexander's chair at the head of the table while 6 very confused executives from a shipping conglomerate watched in silence. "Hi," she said simply, and held up her arms. Alexander, mortified and strangely undone all at once, had gently guided her back out of the room before anyone could see how badly his hands were shaking. That night, alone in his study, he opened the drawer where he kept her crayon drawing and sat there for nearly an hour, just looking at it. He hadn't cried in 741 days. He came close that night. Closer than he had in a very long time. Grace, meanwhile, was terrified she was about to lose the best-paying job she'd ever had. Every incident report she imagined Alexander filing against her felt like another nail in the coffin of her family's already fragile finances. She began keeping Daisy closer, shortening their time in common areas of the house, trying desperately to make her daughter invisible to a man who clearly wanted nothing to do with either of them. But Daisy, in the beautiful, stubborn way that only very young children can be, refused to be kept away. "Mommy, why is the sad man always sad?" she asked one evening as Grace tucked her into bed in the small staff cottage on the estate grounds. Grace paused, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "I think he lost someone he loved very much, sweetheart. Sometimes when grown-ups lose someone, it makes them sad for a really long time." Daisy considered this with the solemn seriousness only a 3-year-old can manage. "Did somebody hug him? When my heart hurt, you hugged me and it got better." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "I don't know, baby. Maybe nobody has, in a long time." That was all Daisy needed to hear. The next morning, she woke up with a plan. She found Alexander in the garden, a rare sighting since he almost never walked through the grounds Elena had designed. He stood near a bed of white roses that had bloomed without anyone asking them to, staring at them the way a man stares at a grave. Daisy toddled up beside him, quiet for once, and simply looked at the roses too. "Pretty," she said softly. Alexander glanced down at her, startled that she'd approached without her usual noise and energy. "Yes," he said quietly. They were her favorite. He didn't know why he said it. He hadn't spoken about Elena out loud to another living soul in months. But something about the small, quiet presence beside him, someone too young to judge, too young to pity him, too young to do anything but simply be there, loosened something in his chest that had been locked tight for 2 years. Daisy reached out one small hand and, without asking permission, wrapped it around 2 of his fingers. Alexander didn't pull away. They stood there together in silence for almost 5 minutes, a grieving billionaire and a fatherless toddler, 2 strangers connected by loss neither of them had chosen, standing among roses that bloomed anyway, no matter how much sorrow surrounded them. It was in that moment, though Alexander wouldn't fully understand it until much later, that everything began to change. Because grief, real grief, doesn't heal through grand gestures or perfectly worded speeches. It heals in small moments. In quiet hands holding fingers. In flowers left on chairs. In someone simply choosing, over and over again, not to give up on you. And Daisy Miller, 3 years old, had absolutely no intention of giving up. Before we get to the moment you've all been waiting for, the moment that gives this story its title, I need you to understand just how far Alexander Whitfield had traveled from the man he used to be. Because what happens next only means something if you understand what it cost him to let it happen. 6 weeks had passed since the day in the rose garden. 6 weeks of small, quiet moments that neither Alexander nor Grace spoke about directly, as if naming the shift happening inside that enormous, lonely house might somehow scare it away. Alexander had started reading in the sunroom instead of his study, the very room Daisy liked to play in during her mother's afternoon shifts. He told himself it was because the light was better. Grace knew better than to say otherwise. He'd started asking Grace small questions, how Daisy was sleeping, whether she liked the little wooden puzzle he'd noticed in the toy bin, whether the staff cottage heating worked well enough for the coming winter. Grace answered every question carefully, still half convinced this was some kind of test she might fail. But it wasn't a test. It was a man, slowly, painfully, remembering what it felt like to care about something outside his own grief. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October. Grace had been called away suddenly. A burst pipe in the east wing needed her attention, and the estate's assistant housekeeper had called in sick. She'd asked one of the kitchen staff to watch Daisy for 20 minutes, but in the chaos of the emergency, the toddler had wandered off, small feet carrying her down the long marble hallway toward the one room in the house she'd learned to associate with the sad man who was slowly becoming less sad. She found Alexander in his study, sitting perfectly still, a framed photograph in his hands. It was a picture of Elena, laughing, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, taken just 3 weeks before the accident. Today would have been her birthday. Alexander hadn't told anyone. He hadn't told anyone in 2 years how heavy October felt, how the entire month seemed to press down on his chest like a physical weight he could never quite shrug off. He didn't hear Daisy come in. He didn't notice her at all until she was standing directly in front of him, her enormous brown eyes taking in the tears he hadn't even realized were falling. "Mr. Alex sad," she said. Not a question. A simple, devastating observation. Alexander quickly wiped his face, embarrassed, ashamed even, to be caught like this by a child. "I'm okay, sweetheart. You should go find your mommy." But Daisy didn't move. She stood there, watching him with the kind of focused, uncomplicated concern that only very young children seem capable of. Not pity, not awkwardness, just genuine care for another human being who was hurting. And then she asked the question, "Can I hug you? Just once?" 6 simple words. Words she'd been trying to say, in one way or another, for 6 weeks. Words that carried more weight than she could possibly understand. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct, the instinct he'd trained into himself for 2 years, was to say no. To pull away. To protect himself from the vulnerability of being touched, of being needed, of letting anyone, even a 3-year-old, close enough to see him break. But something about the photograph still in his hands, something about Elena's laughing face, something about the empty nursery down the hall that he'd never had the strength to clear out, something about all of it collided at once inside his chest. He nodded, because he couldn't trust his voice to speak. Daisy climbed carefully into his lap, an awkward, toddler-sized maneuver involving one knee planted directly in his stomach, and wrapped her small arms around his neck as far as they would reach. She held on with the fierce, uncomplicated commitment that only children seem capable of, her cheek pressed against his shoulder. "It's okay to be sad," she whispered. Words she'd clearly heard from her own mother during her own moments of grief. "Mommy says sad means you loved somebody really, really big." And Alexander Whitfield, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, a man who had sat stone-faced through his own wife's funeral because he refused to let his board see him cry, a man who had built walls so high that even his own family had stopped trying to reach him, broke completely. He wrapped his arms around the little girl and sobbed. Not the quiet, controlled tears he sometimes allowed himself late at night, alone, when no one could see. Real, gutting, shoulder-shaking sobs, 2 years of grief pouring out of him all at once, held together only by the small, warm weight of a toddler who had simply refused to let him carry it alone anymore. Grace found them like that 10 minutes later, having finally handled the emergency and rushed back to find her daughter missing. She stood frozen in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, watching her employer, the coldest, most unreachable man she'd ever worked for, cry into her daughter's hair while Daisy patted his back gently, the way you'd comfort a friend, murmuring it's okay, over and over. "I'm so sorry," Grace finally managed, stepping forward to retrieve her daughter, terrified of what she'd just witnessed, terrified of what it might mean for her job. "Daisy, we do not just walk into people's private." "It's all right, Grace," Alexander said, his voice raw, wiping his face with the back of his hand as he looked up at her. There was something different in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there in 787 days. She didn't do anything wrong. He looked down at Daisy, still curled against his chest, and for the first time in 2 years, something that almost resembled a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Thank you," he said quietly, to a 3-year-old who would probably never fully understand the magnitude of what she'd just done. "Nobody has hugged me since the funeral." Grace's own eyes filled with tears at that admission, at the sheer, devastating loneliness contained in that one sentence. In that moment, watching her daughter comfort a grieving billionaire with nothing but a hug and a few whispered words, something shifted in Grace too. She saw, for the first time, not a cold employer, but a man drowning in a grief so heavy he'd forgotten how to ask for help. None of them knew it yet, but that single hug had set something in motion that could not be undone. And not everyone in Alexander Whitfield's life was going to be happy about it. Because somewhere across town, in a penthouse apartment overlooking the Manhattan skyline, a woman named Vanessa Calloway was about to find out that the grieving billionaire she'd been patiently waiting to marry for the better part of a year had just cried in the arms of his housekeeper's daughter. And Vanessa did not share well. Quick question before we continue. Do you believe some people love genuinely, and some people only love what they can gain? Let me know in the comments, because what you're about to see is about to test that question completely. Vanessa Calloway had known Alexander Whitfield for 6 years. She'd been introduced to him at a charity gala by mutual business associates, back when Elena was still alive, back when Vanessa had been nothing more than a pleasant acquaintance who occasionally showed up at the same social functions. She'd watched, from a careful distance, as Elena Whitfield lit up every room she walked into, and she'd watched, with far less careful feelings, as Alexander adored his wife with a kind of devotion that made other men look inadequate by comparison. Vanessa had told herself, for years, that her fascination with Alexander was simply professional admiration. He was, after all, one of the most successful businessmen on the East Coast, and her family's investment firm had done considerable work with Whitfield Industries. But when Elena died, something in Vanessa had shifted from admiration into calculation. She'd given it a respectable amount of time, nearly 8 months, before she began checking in on Alexander with increasing frequency. Dinner invitations he mostly declined. Phone calls he mostly let go to voicemail. But Vanessa was patient, and more importantly, Vanessa was persistent in the specific way that people who have never truly been told no tend to be. Over the past year, she'd worked her way from occasional acquaintance to what she considered, in her own mind, Alexander's unofficial partner. She attended events on his arm when he needed a date to avoid awkward questions. She'd started making decisions about the estate's social calendar without asking him first. She'd even begun referring to herself, in certain circles, as practically engaged to Alexander Whitfield, despite the fact that he had never once proposed, and had, if anything, kept her at a careful, polite distance that she chose to interpret as grief rather than genuine disinterest. When her assistant, who happened to be dating one of the Whitfield estate's junior kitchen staff, mentioned offhand that the boss actually cried in front of everyone over the housekeeper's little girl, Vanessa's entire carefully constructed plan felt the ground shift beneath it. She showed up at the Whitfield estate that same evening, unannounced, dressed in the kind of effortless elegance that came from a lifetime of never worrying about money. "Alexander, darling, I heard the most concerning thing today," she said, finding him in his study, the same room where he'd broken down hours earlier. His eyes were still faintly red, though he'd composed himself considerably. "Something about a scene with the staff." "It wasn't a scene, Vanessa." His voice carried a weariness that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of dealing with her. It was a private moment that somehow became estate gossip within a matter of hours. "I only worry because I care about you," she said, settling herself into the chair across from his desk without being invited to. "You've been so isolated, Alexander. It's natural that the first person to show you a little kindness would feel significant. But you have to understand how it looks, a grown man, sobbing into the arms of a member of his household staff's toddler. People talk. Let them talk." Alexander's tone had an edge to it Vanessa rarely heard directed at her. "For the first time in 2 years, I felt something other than numb, Vanessa. I'm not going to apologize for that." Vanessa recalibrated instantly, sensing that direct criticism wasn't working. She softened her voice, reached across the desk to rest her hand over his. "I'm happy you're healing, truly. I just think it's important to be careful about who you let get close to you during something this vulnerable. People take advantage of grief, Alexander. Especially people who understand exactly how much you're worth." The insinuation landed exactly as she intended it to. She watched a flicker of doubt cross his face. "Not much, but enough. Grace has never once asked me for anything," Alexander said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Of course she hasn't asked yet," Vanessa said gently, patting his hand before rising to leave. "It's still early." Over the following 2 weeks, Vanessa executed her plan with the patient precision of someone who had spent her entire life getting what she wanted. She began appearing at the estate more frequently, always with some concern to raise, always framing her worries as care rather than manipulation. She happened to mention to 2 of Alexander's board members that she was concerned about unprofessional dynamics within the household staff. She hired a private investigator, quietly, carefully, to look into Grace Miller's background, searching for anything that could be used to paint her as manipulative, as a gold digger, as anything other than what she actually was, a grieving widow trying to keep her daughter fed and housed. The investigator found nothing damning, because there was nothing damning to find. Grace Miller was, by every measure, exactly who she appeared to be, a hard-working single mother with no criminal record, no debt beyond ordinary medical bills, and no history of anything remotely resembling the manipulative behavior Vanessa was hoping to uncover. So Vanessa did what people like Vanessa do when the truth doesn't serve their purposes. She created a different one. Working with the investigator, a man whose discretion cost considerably more than his actual investigative skills, Vanessa fabricated a series of documents suggesting Grace had been let go from a previous position for theft. She forged an old reference letter, doctored dates on a resignation notice, and prepared a compelling, entirely false narrative that painted Grace Miller as a woman with a documented history of taking advantage of wealthy employers. She waited 3 more days, letting the bond between Alexander and Daisy grow just a little deeper, knowing, with cold calculation, that the deeper it grew, the more devastating the eventual betrayal would feel, and the more desperately Alexander would want someone he could trust completely. Someone like her. On a Friday evening, Vanessa requested a private meeting with Alexander, And this time, she came prepared with a folder of fabricated evidence and a story rehearsed to devastating effect. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you this," she said, sliding the folder across his desk, her voice carefully arranged into something resembling reluctant concern. "I only had her investigated because I was worried about you, Alexander. I never imagined I'd actually find something." Alexander opened the folder with trembling hands, and as he read through page after page of carefully constructed lies, something in his chest, the same chest that had finally, painfully, begun to open again after 2 years of being sealed shut, started closing all over again. "She's been lying to you this entire time," Vanessa said softly, watching the color drain from his face. "About who she is. About what she wants from you. I'm so sorry, Alexander. I know how much it hurt to trust someone again." What Alexander didn't know, what none of them knew yet, standing in that study while a lifetime of careful manipulation unfolded exactly as planned, was that the woman he'd trusted with his most private grief was about to be torn away from him based on lies designed by a woman who had never once cared about his heart at all, only about what came attached to it. If you've ever had someone you trusted turn out to be lying to protect themselves, or someone lie about you to protect their own interests, this next part is going to hit close to home. Stay with me. Alexander confronted Grace the following morning, the fabricated folder clutched in his hand, his voice colder than it had been in the 6 weeks since Daisy's hug had first started thawing something inside him. "I need you to explain this," he said, sliding the papers across the kitchen island where Grace had been preparing Daisy's breakfast. Grace's confusion was immediate and genuine. She scanned the document, a supposed termination letter from a family in Westchester she'd never worked for, citing theft accusations that had never happened, and her face went pale with a mixture of shock and fear. "Mr. Whitfield, I have never seen this document in my life. I have never worked for a family named Ashford. I don't know where this came from, but I promise you, on my daughter's life, I have never stolen anything from anyone." "Then how do you explain it existing?" His voice was hard, defended, the voice of a man who had trusted someone completely and was now terrified he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Grace's hands were shaking as she set down the spatula, her mind racing to make sense of paperwork that shouldn't exist. "I can't explain something I've never seen before. Please, you have to believe me." But belief, once fractured by fear, doesn't reassemble easily. Alexander had spent 2 years building walls specifically to protect himself from exactly this feeling. The vertigo of trusting someone and then discovering you might have been wrong. Even as some part of him recognized the desperate honesty in Grace's eyes, a louder, more frightened part of him remembered exactly how much losing someone had cost him last time. "I think it's best if you take some time away from the estate while I look into this further," he said, unable to meet her eyes. Grace's world tilted on its axis. This job wasn't just income, it was the only thing standing between her and losing the small cottage she and Daisy called home, the only thing keeping food on their table and a roof over their heads. "Mr. Whitfield, please. I have a daughter to support. I need this position." "I'll ensure you're paid through the end of the month," he said, his voice tight, clipped, the voice of a man retreating behind walls he'd only just begun to lower. "But I need to sort this out." Daisy, sensing the tension in the room the way young children always do, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why is Mr. Alex mad?" Grace scooped her daughter up. Tears she was fighting hard to hold back finally breaking free. "We have to go home for a little while, baby." As they walked out of the kitchen, Daisy looked back over her mother's shoulder at Alexander, her small face confused and hurt in a way that would haunt him for days to come. "Bye, Mr. Alex," she said softly. "I still love you." The words hit him like a physical blow. He stood frozen in the kitchen long after they'd gone, the fabricated folder still in his hands, something in his gut telling him he'd just made a terrible mistake but too consumed by fear and old grief to trust that instinct yet. Over the following days, the estate felt more hollow than it had in months. Alexander threw himself into work, staying at the Manhattan office until midnight most nights, avoiding the empty rooms where Daisy's laughter used to echo. But something wasn't sitting right with him. Grace's face, her desperate honesty, kept replaying in his mind. The way she'd looked at him, not with the calculated concern Vanessa always seemed to perform, but with genuine, frightened bewilderment. It was his longtime executive assistant, Marcus, a man who'd worked for Alexander for nearly a decade and had watched him slowly come back to life over the past 6 weeks, who finally said what needed saying. "Sir, Forgive me for speaking out of turn, but I've watched you change since Grace and her daughter started here. I've watched you smile for the first time in 2 years. And I've also watched Ms. Calloway grow increasingly threatened by that change. Have you considered who actually benefits from Grace being removed from this house? The question landed like a key turning in a lock Alexander hadn't realized was still shut. He pulled up the fabricated document again that night, this time actually examining it rather than simply reacting to it. The letterhead was slightly wrong, a font that didn't quite match legitimate corporate stationery from that time period. The signature looked practiced rather than natural. And the family name, Ashford, when he had it quietly researched by his legal team the following morning, turned out to correspond to an actual family in Westchester. One who, when discreetly contacted, confirmed they had never in their lives employed a housekeeper named Grace Miller. The forgery unraveled within 48 hours once someone actually bothered to look closely. It took his private investigator only 3 more days to trace the fabricated documents back to the same investigator Vanessa had quietly hired weeks earlier. The same man, it turned out, who had a documented history of producing creative paperwork for wealthy clients willing to pay for convenient truths. Alexander sat in his study that evening with the real report in front of him. Proof of Vanessa's manipulation laid out in devastating, undeniable detail, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Shame. Not just at Vanessa's cruelty, but at his own willingness to believe the worst about someone who had done nothing but show him and his household genuine, uncomplicated kindness. He thought about Daisy's small voice at the door. I still love you. He thought about Grace's desperate honesty, the fear in her eyes not for herself, but for her daughter's stability. He thought about 794 days of grief, and how in the span of 6 short weeks, a 3-year-old girl and her mother had done more to heal him than 2 years of therapy, silence, and isolation combined. And he realized, with sudden, overwhelming clarity, exactly what he had let fear cost him. He needed to fix this. Immediately. Before it was too late. We're almost at the end now, and I promise you, everything that's been building is about to come together. If you're crying already, you're not alone. Let's finish this together. Alexander confronted Vanessa the following afternoon, the real investigative report spread across his desk between them, his voice steady in a way that surprised even him. You forged documents to destroy an innocent woman's reputation because you were afraid of losing your position in my life, he said, watching her carefully composed expression falter for just a moment before she attempted, uselessly, to recover it. Alexander, I only wanted to protect you. Don't. The single word carried more weight than she'd ever heard from him. I've spent 2 years grieving my wife, and somewhere in that grief, I let myself believe that what you offered, companionship without vulnerability, convenience without genuine care, was enough. It wasn't real, Vanessa. It was never real. You didn't want me. You wanted what came attached to me. Vanessa's mask finally slipped entirely. Do you have any idea what I gave up, waiting for you to be ready? Do you understand what people like us are supposed to build together? Legacy, standing, an empire that actually makes sense. And you're going to throw that away for a maid and her toddler. I'm going to throw it away, Alexander said quietly. Because for the first time in 2 years, someone made me feel like a person instead of a portfolio. I should have seen what you were the moment you tried to convince me to distrust the one thing in my life that finally felt real again. He had his legal team draft a formal cease and desist regarding any further contact and quietly ensured, through channels available to men of his resources, that the investigator responsible for the forged documents would face consequences serious enough to guarantee he never attempted anything similar again. Vanessa Calloway left the Whitfield estate that afternoon and, for all her careful social climbing, never fully recovered her standing in the circles she'd worked so hard to belong to. Word travels, especially among people who value trust above almost everything else. But confronting Vanessa was the easy part. Finding Grace again, and finding the words to fix what his fear had broken, proved far harder. He drove to the small apartment complex on the edge of town where Grace and Daisy had moved after leaving the estate cottage, having lost not just their income but their housing in a single devastating week. He stood outside the door for nearly 10 minutes before he found the courage to knock, rehearsing apologies that all felt hopelessly inadequate for what he'd put them through. Grace opened the door, exhaustion etched into every line of her face, and her expression hardened the moment she recognized him. Whatever you're here to say, Mr. Whitfield, I think you've said enough. Grace, please. Give me 5 minutes. His voice cracked in a way he didn't try to hide. I found out the truth. Vanessa fabricated everything. I should have trusted you from the beginning, and I let fear make a decision that hurt you and Daisy in ways I can't take back, and I am so sorry. Grace's arms were crossed tightly over her chest, protecting herself against a hurt that clearly still ran deep. Do you understand what the past week has been like? I had nowhere to go. I had to explain to my 3-year-old why we don't get to see you anymore, why the man she'd grown to love apparently thought her mother was a thief. She cried herself to sleep for 4 nights straight asking when we could go back and see Mr. Alex. Every word landed like a blow he knew he deserved. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm asking anyway. Not just for myself, for both of you. You and Daisy brought something back to life in me that I genuinely believed had died along with my wife and daughter. I don't want to lose that because I let fear win. From inside the small apartment, a familiar voice called out, "Mommy, who's at the door?" Daisy appeared behind her mother's legs, and the moment her eyes landed on Alexander, her entire face transformed, confusion, then disbelief, then pure, uncomplicated joy. "Mr. Alex." She launched herself forward, and Grace, too surprised to stop her, watched her daughter wrap her small arms around Alexander's legs with the same fierce devotion she'd shown that day in his study. Alexander crouched down immediately, scooping the little girl into his arms, his composure finally breaking as tears he'd been holding back streamed freely down his face. "I missed you so much," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry I let you down." "It's okay to be sad," Daisy said, patting his back the exact same way she had weeks earlier. "But you're not sad now. You're happy crying. That's a different one." Grace stood in the doorway, watching her daughter comfort the man who had, only a week earlier, sent them both away, and felt her own careful defenses beginning, reluctantly, to crumble. "I need you to understand something," Alexander said, standing slowly, Daisy still cradled against his chest, refusing to be put down. "I'm not asking you to simply come back to work for me. I'm asking for the chance to earn back your trust properly. To prove that what's grown between us these past weeks, between all 3 of us, is worth fighting for. I don't want you as my housekeeper anymore, Grace. I want the chance to know you. Really know you. If you'll let me." Grace's eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. It had been 18 months since she'd allowed herself to imagine being cared for by anyone again, 18 months of carrying every burden alone, certain that vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. But watching Alexander hold her daughter, watching the genuine devastation in his eyes over the pain he'd caused, watching a man who commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar mergers stand humbled on her doorstep, begging for a second chance, something in her finally allowed itself to hope again. "Okay," she whispered. "We can try." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a fairy tale promise. It was 2 wounded people, cautiously choosing to trust each other again, one small, honest step at a time. And sometimes, that's exactly how real love begins. We've made it to the end, and I want to say, thank you for staying with this story until the very last word. What you're about to read is the reason we tell stories like this one. Let's finish it together. 6 months later, the Whitfield estate looked nothing like the museum it had once been. The gardens Elena had designed, long neglected in Alexander's grief, bloomed again under the care of a groundskeeper who'd been given actual instructions for the first time in 2 years. The library, once a room Alexander retreated from whenever Daisy entered, had become the gathering place of the household. Bookshelves rearranged to include a small, low shelf filled with picture books, a reading nook built specifically for a 4-year-old who now considered the enormous room entirely her own. Grace no longer worked as the estate's housekeeper. After weeks of careful, patient rebuilding, dinners together, long conversations on the porch after Daisy had gone to sleep, the slow, unhurried process of 2 grieving people learning to trust again, Alexander had asked her to move into the main house, not as staff, but as something else entirely. Something neither of them had expected to find again after everything they'd both lost. He proposed in the rose garden, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in April, surrounded by the same white roses Elena had planted years before. He'd spoken with Grace at length about it beforehand, about honoring his late wife's memory while still allowing himself to build something new, about how loving Grace didn't erase what he'd shared with Elena. It simply proved that his heart, once broken, was capable of healing into something whole again. Grace said yes with tears streaming down her face, and Daisy, watching from a few feet away clutching her one-eared stuffed rabbit, cheered so loudly that half the estate staff came running to see what had happened. "Does this mean you're going to be my daddy now?" Daisy asked later that evening, climbing into Alexander's lap the way she had 100 times since that very first hug in his study. Alexander felt his throat tighten, the same overwhelming emotion from that rainy October afternoon rising up in him again. Except this time, instead of grief, it was something closer to pure, uncomplicated joy. "If you'll have me," he said softly. Daisy considered this with the same serious focus she brought to every important decision in her small life, before wrapping her arms around his neck. "I already picked you," she said simply. "A long time ago. When you were sad and needed a hug." Alexander held her close, looking over her small shoulder at Grace, who stood in the doorway watching them with a kind of quiet, overwhelming love that comes only from watching two broken hearts find their way toward wholeness together. They were married the following autumn, in the same garden where the proposal had happened, surrounded by close friends, loyal staff who had watched this transformation unfold with their own eyes, and one very excited 4-year-old flower girl who insisted on hugging every single guest before they were allowed to sit down. If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's this. Grief doesn't disappear because time passes. It softens, slowly, painfully, only when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to let new love in, even when every instinct tells us it's safer to keep the walls up. Sometimes healing doesn't come from grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it comes from a 3-year-old's small hands, asking for nothing more than a single hug, refusing to give up on a broken heart until it remembers how to beat again. Alexander Whitfield had spent 2 years believing that love, once lost, could never truly be found again. It took the simple, fearless honesty of a child too young to understand grief, but wise enough to understand kindness, to prove him wrong. Because sometimes, the people who save us aren't the ones we're looking for at all. Sometimes, they're the ones who find us first. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me while writing it, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs a reminder that healing is always possible, and subscribe for more stories about broken hearts finding their way home. Until next time, take care of each other. The end.